The Red-Headed League, the strangest crime Sherlock ever solved. Chapter 1. The Man Who Never Was. The fog clung to the streets of London like a shroud, muffling the clatter of hooves and the distant cries of newsboys. It was a night that seemed to swallow time itself, and I found myself staring into the fire at 221B Baker Street, nursing a brandy and pondering the peculiar case that had just been laid before us. Holmes sat across from me, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes half closed in that familiar posture of deep thought. The gaslight flickered, casting shadows that danced across his sharp features. On the table between us lay a single sheet of paper, its contents as baffling as they were unsettling. "Watson," he said at last, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "what do you make of this?" I picked up the paper and read it again, though I already knew its contents by heart. It was a report from Scotland Yard, detailing the disappearance of one Mr. Alastair Greaves, a man of some standing in the financial world, or so it seemed. The report was riddled with contradictions. Greaves' name appeared in some ledgers, but not others. His home address, once a stately townhouse in Mayfair, was now listed as a vacant lot. His wife, when questioned, claimed she had never been married. His colleagues at the bank could not recall his face. "It's as if the man never existed," I said, setting the paper down. "And yet, here we are, investigating his disappearance." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with that peculiar intensity that always signaled his interest in a case. "Precisely, Watson. A man erased, not merely dead, but wiped from the collective memory of society. A fascinating puzzle, wouldn't you say?" I frowned. Fascinating, perhaps, but also deeply unsettling. How can a man vanish so completely? And why? Holmes rose and began to pace the room, his movements fluid and deliberate. "The how is a matter of method, Watson. The why is a matter of motive. And both, I suspect, are far more sinister than we can yet imagine." He stopped abruptly and turned to face me. "Tell me, Watson, have you noticed anything unusual about your own memory of late?" The question caught me off guard. My memory? No, I can't say that I have. Why do you ask? Holmes' gaze was piercing. "Because, my dear friend, I have. Twice this week, I have found myself reaching for a file or a reference, only to discover it missing, not misplaced, but gone entirely. And each time, I could have sworn I had seen it only moments before." A chill ran down my spine. "You're suggesting that someone, or something, is tampering with our memories?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he crossed to the window and drew back the curtain, staring out into the fog-shrouded street. "There is a house, Watson," he said softly. "A house that no longer exists, or rather, a house that exists only for those who know to look for it. I believe it holds the key to this mystery." I joined him at the window, though I could see nothing but the swirling mist. "A house that no longer exists? Holmes, you're speaking in riddles." He turned to me, his expression grave. "Am I? Or is it the world itself that has become a riddle? Tell me, Watson, do you trust your own mind?" I hesitated. The question was not one I had ever considered. "Of course I do. Why wouldn't I?" Holmes' lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "Because, my friend, if we are to solve this case, we must first confront the possibility that our own memories may be the greatest obstacle of all." The clock on the mantel struck midnight, its chime echoing through the room like a funeral knell. Holmes turned away from the window and reached for his coat. "Come, Watson. The game is afoot, and I fear it is a game unlike any we have played before." As we stepped out into the foggy night, I could not shake the feeling that we were being watched, not by any visible presence, but by something far more insidious, something that lurked in the shadows of our own minds. And so began our descent into a mystery that would challenge not only Holmes' deductive brilliance, but the very nature of reality itself. Chapter 2. The House That Wasn't There. The cab rattled through the cold streets of Mayfair, the fog so thick it seemed to swallow the gas lamps whole. I sat across from Holmes, who was unusually silent, his gaze fixed on the passing shadows. The weight of his earlier words still hung in the air between us. "Do you trust your own mind?" It was a question I had never thought to ask myself, and now I could think of little else. We arrived at the address listed in the Scotland Yard report, a vacant lot surrounded by a wrought iron fence. The gate creaked as Holmes pushed it open, and we stepped into the overgrown garden. The air was damp, the scent of decaying leaves mingling with the faint tang of coal smoke. "This is where Greaves' home once stood," Holmes said, his voice low. "Also the records claim." I glanced around, my unease growing. The lot was empty, save for a few scattered bricks and a patch of weeds where the foundation might have been. Yet something about the place felt wrong. It was as if the very ground resisted our presence, as though it knew we did not belong. Holmes knelt, running his fingers over the cracked pavement. "Watson, do you see that?" I followed his gaze. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just the same patch of weeds and rubble. But then, as I stared, the edges of the lot seemed to blur, the fog thickening, until I could have sworn I saw the outline of a house. It was there for only a moment, a fleeting impression of brick and ivy, before it vanished. I blinked, shaking my head. "Holmes, did you?" "Yes," he said, rising to his feet. "That house is still here, Watson, but only for those who know to look for it." A shiver ran down my spine. How is that possible? Holmes did not answer. Instead, he turned to a passerby, a man in a bowler hat, hurrying through the fog. "Excuse me, sir," Holmes called out. "Can you tell me if there was ever a house on this lot?" The man stopped, frowning. "A house? No, sir. That lot's been empty for as long as I can remember." Holmes thanked him and turned back to me, his expression unreadable. "Curious, is it not? A house that exists only for us, or perhaps only for those who are aware of its existence." I felt a growing sense of disorientation, as if the ground beneath my feet were shifting. "Holmes, this is beyond anything we've encountered before. How can we investigate something that doesn't exist?" Holmes' eyes gleamed. "On the contrary, Watson. The fact that the house is hidden makes it all the more significant. It suggests that someone or something does not wish it to be found. And that, my friend, is precisely why we must find it." He began to pace the perimeter of the lot, his keen eyes scanning every detail. I followed, my mind racing. The fog seemed to close in around us, muffling the sounds of the city until it felt as though we were alone in some otherworldly realm. "Here," Holmes said suddenly, stopping at a patch of ivy-covered wall. He brushed the leaves aside, revealing a small weathered plaque. The inscription was barely legible. "To those who seek the truth, the door is always open." I stared at the plaque, my unease deepening. "What does it mean?" Holmes straightened, his expression grim. "It means, Watson, that we are dealing with a force far more powerful than we imagined. A force that can erase not only men, but entire buildings from history. And if we are not careful, it may erase us as well." He turned to me, his voice low and urgent. "We must proceed with caution. Every step we take brings us closer to the truth, but also closer to danger. Are you prepared for what lies ahead?" I met his gaze, my resolve hardening. "I am, Holmes, whatever it takes." Holmes nodded, a flicker of approval in his eyes. "Good. Then let us begin." As we left the lot, I glanced back one last time. The fog had thickened, obscuring the plaque and the ivy-covered wall, but for a moment I thought I saw the outline of the house again, its windows dark and lifeless, as if watching us go. The game was indeed afoot, and I could not shake the feeling that we were no longer the hunters, but the hunted. Chapter 3. The Secret Order. The fire crackled in the hearth of 221B Baker Street, casting flickering shadows across the room. Holmes sat in his armchair, his pipe in hand, though it had long since gone cold. His eyes were fixed on a small, leather-bound book he had procured from the depths of his library, a volume so ancient its pages threatened to crumble at the slightest touch. I sat across from him, nursing a cup of tea that had grown cold as well. My mind was still reeling from our encounter at the vacant lot. The fleeting glimpse of the house, the cryptic plaque, and the passerby's blank stare, it all felt like fragments of a dream slipping through my fingers. "Holmes," I said at last, breaking the silence, "what have you found?" He looked up, his expression unreadable. "A name, Watson. A name that has surfaced in the most obscure corners of history. The Red-Headed League." I frowned. The Red-Headed League? It sounds like some sort of social club. Holmes' lips twitched in a faint smile. "On the surface, perhaps, but dig deeper, and you will find something far more sinister. This league is no mere gathering of red-headed gentlemen. It is a secret order, one that has existed for centuries, operating in the shadows and manipulating the very fabric of history." I set my cup down, my unease growing. Manipulating history? How? Holmes leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with that familiar intensity. "By erasing it, Watson. By altering records, rewriting memories, and ensuring that certain truths are never known. They are the architects of oblivion, and their work is meticulous." I shook my head, struggling to comprehend. But why? What could they possibly gain from such a thing? "Power," Holmes said simply. "The power to control the narrative of history itself. Imagine, Watson, a world where the past is not fixed but malleable, where events can be rewritten and individuals erased with the stroke of a pen. That is the world the Red-Headed League seeks to create." I felt a chill run down my spine. And Alastair Greaves? Was he one of their victims? Holmes nodded. "I believe so. Greaves must have stumbled upon something they wished to keep hidden. And so they erased him, not just from the present, but from the past as well." I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. "But how can we fight something like this, Holmes? If they can alter history, how can we even trust our own memories?" Holmes' expression darkened. "That, Watson, is the crux of the matter. Our memories may be our greatest weakness, or our only weapon. We must rely on logic, on the evidence before us, and on the patterns that even they cannot erase." He opened the ancient book and pointed to a passage written in a spidery hand. "This text refers to a ritual, a ceremony performed by the League to seal the past and silence the future. It is said that those who witness the ritual are forever changed, their memories rewritten to align with the League's version of history." I stared at the page, though the words were indecipherable to me. "And you believe this ritual is connected to Greaves' disappearance?" "I do," Holmes said. "But there is more. The text also mentions a symbol, a red thread, woven through the fabric of time. It is their mark, Watson, and I believe it is the key to unraveling their conspiracy." He closed the book and set it aside, his gaze distant. "We must find that thread, Watson, and we must do so quickly, before they erase us as well." I felt a surge of determination, tempered by a growing sense of dread. "Where do we begin?" Holmes rose and crossed to the window, staring out into the foggy night. "With the man who gave us the case, Inspector Lestrade. There is something he is not telling us, something he may not even realize he knows." I stood, joining him at the window. "You think Lestrade is involved?" Holmes shook his head. "Not willingly, but he may have been manipulated, his memories altered to serve their purposes. We must question him again, carefully." As we prepared to leave, I glanced at the ancient book on the table. Its pages seemed to whisper of secrets too dangerous to know, of truths that could unravel the mind. "Holmes," I said quietly, "what if we succeed? What if we uncover the truth, only to have it erased from our memories. He turned to me, his expression grave. Then, Watson, we must ensure that the truth is not forgotten, even if we cannot remember it ourselves. The weight of his words settled over me like a shroud as we stepped out into the night. The fog was thicker now, the streets eerily silent. Somewhere in the darkness, the red-headed Lee was watching, waiting. And we were walking straight into their web. Chapter 4. The First Suspect. The cab ride to Scotland Yard was a quiet one. Holmes sat with his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the passing streets, while I wrestled with the implications of what we had learned. The Red-Headed League. A secret order capable of rewriting history, erasing individuals, and manipulating memories. It was a concept so vast and terrifying that it threatened to overwhelm my rational mind. Yet Holmes, as always, seemed unshaken, his focus razor-sharp. Inspector Lestrade was waiting for us in his office, his expression a mixture of curiosity and irritation. "Holmes, Watson," he greeted us, gesturing to the chairs across from his desk. "What brings you here at this hour? More questions about Greaves?" Holmes took a seat, his movements deliberate. "Indeed, Lestrade, there are aspects of this case that require further clarification. Tell me, what do you recall about the man who reported Greaves' disappearance?" Lestrade frowned, leaning back in his chair. It was a colleague of his, a banker named Edmund Hargrave. He came to us a week ago, claiming Greaves had vanished without a trace, but when we looked into it, we found no record of Greaves ever existing. It was as if the man had been plucked from the world entirely. Holmes steepled his fingers, his eyes narrowing. "And Hargrave, did he seem credible?" Lestrade hesitated. "At the time, yes. He was well-spoken, well-dressed, the picture of respectability. But now," he trailed off, shaking his head. "Now, I'm not so sure. When we tried to follow up with him, he claimed he had no memory of making the report. Said he'd never heard of Alastair Greaves." I exchanged a glance with Holmes. This was precisely the kind of inconsistency we had come to expect. "Where can we find Hargrave?" Holmes asked. Lestrade scribbled an address on a piece of paper and handed it to Holmes. "He works at the Bank of England. But Holmes, if you're planning to confront him, be careful. There's something off about this whole affair." Holmes stood, pocketing the address. "Thank you, Lestrade. Your assistance, as always, is invaluable." As we left the office, I couldn't help but notice the unease in Lestrade's eyes. It was a look I had seen before, a man grappling with something he could not understand. The Bank of England loomed before us, its grand facade a testament to the power and stability of the British Empire. Yet as we stepped inside, I felt a strange dissonance, as though the very air were charged with tension. Holmes approached the front desk, his tone polite but firm. "We are here to see Mr. Edmund Hargrave. It is a matter of some urgency." The clerk, a young man with a nervous demeanor, glanced at a ledger before shaking his head. "I'm sorry, sir, but there is no one by that name employed here." Holmes' expression did not change, but I saw the flicker of interest in his eyes. "Are you certain? He was reported to be a senior banker." The clerk hesitated, his brow furrowing. I don't recall anyone by that name. But if you'd like, I can check the records." Holmes nodded, and the clerk disappeared into a back room. Moments later, he returned, looking even more confused. "I'm sorry, sir. There's no record of an Edmund Hargrave ever working here." I felt a chill run down my spine. Another man erased, just like Greaves. Holmes thanked the clerk and led me outside, his pace brisk. "Watson," he said quietly, "do you see the pattern? Hargrave was the one who reported Greaves' disappearance, and now he too has been erased." I nodded, my mind racing. "But why? What connects them?" Holmes' eyes gleamed. "That, Watson, is the question, and I believe the answer lies in the bank itself. We circled the building, Holmes' sharp eyes scanning every detail. At the rear of the bank, we found a narrow alleyway, its entrance partially obscured by a stack of crates. Holmes paused, his gaze fixed on a small, weathered door set into the wall. "This way," he said, pushing the door open. The room beyond was dimly lit, its walls lined with shelves of ledgers and documents. At a desk in the corner sat a man, his head bowed over a stack of papers. He looked up as we entered, his eyes widening in surprise. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice trembling. "This area is restricted." Holmes stepped forward, his tone calm but authoritative. "We are looking for Edmund Hargrave. Can you tell us where we might find him?" The man's face paled. "Hargrave? I don't know anyone by that name." Holmes studied him for a moment before reaching into his pocket and producing a small, red thread. He held it up, his eyes never leaving the man's face. "Do you recognize this?" The man's reaction was immediate. He recoiled, his hands shaking. "Where did you get that?" Holmes' smile was thin and humorless. "From the fabric of history itself. Tell me, what do you know of the Red-Headed League?" The man's composure shattered. He rose from his chair, backing away from us. "I don't know anything. Please, you must leave." Holmes took a step closer, his voice low and menacing. "You do know something, and if you value your life, you will tell us." The man's eyes darted to the door, then back to Holmes. For a moment, it seemed he might bolt. But then, with a shuddering breath, he collapsed into his chair, his face buried in his hands. "They'll kill me," he whispered. "If I tell you, they'll kill me." Holmes leaned in, his voice barely audible. "And if you don't, they'll erase you, just like they erased Hargrave and Greaves. The choice is yours." The man looked up, his eyes filled with terror, and then he began to speak. As we left the bank, the weight of what we had learned settled over me like a storm cloud. The man's words echoed in my mind, each one more chilling than the last. Holmes, however, seemed energized, his steps quick and purposeful. "We are close, Watson," he said. "Closer than they realize." I nodded, though I could not share his optimism. The deeper we delved into this mystery, the more I felt the ground shifting beneath my feet, and I could not shake the feeling that we were running out of time. Chapter 5. The Vanishing Clue. The man's name was Thomas Wickham, a low-level clerk at the Bank of England who had stumbled upon something he was never meant to see. His confession, though fragmented and laced with fear, had given us our first tangible lead. A ledger hidden deep within the bank's archives, one that supposedly contained records of transactions tied to the Red-Headed League. Holmes had pressed Wickham for its location, but the man had grown increasingly agitated, his words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "They'll know I told you. They'll know," he had cried, before fleeing into the labyrinthine corridors of the bank. We had not pursued him. Holmes had deemed it unnecessary. "He has served his purpose," he had said, his tone grim. Now, we stood in the dimly lit archives, surrounded by towering shelves of dust-covered ledgers. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper and mildew, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath our feet. "This is it," Holmes murmured, running his fingers along the spines of the ledgers. "The ledger Wickham described should be here." I glanced around, my unease growing. "Holmes, do you truly believe this ledger still exists? If the Red-Headed League is as powerful as we suspect, wouldn't they have destroyed it by now?" Holmes paused, his hand hovering over a particularly worn volume. "Perhaps, but even they are not infallible, Watson. They may erase memories and alter records, but physical evidence is harder to conceal, especially when it is hidden by those who fear them." He pulled the ledger from the shelf, its cover cracked and faded. As he opened it, a cloud of dust billowed into the air, catching the faint light from the single gas lamp we had brought with us. The pages were filled with rows of numbers and names, their ink faded but still legible. Holmes' eyes scanned the entries with lightning speed, his lips moving silently as he deciphered the cryptic notations. Then he stopped, his finger resting on a single line. "Here," he said, his voice low. "A series of transactions dated 6 months ago. Payments made to an entity listed only as Arlel, undoubtedly the Red-Headed League. And the amounts. Watson, these are not mere sums of money. They are fortunes." I leaned in, squinting at the faded script. What could they possibly need such wealth for? Holmes' expression darkened. "To fund their operations, Watson. To buy silence, loyalty, and influence. And perhaps to acquire something far more valuable." He flipped to the next page, his movements quick and precise. But as he did, the ledger suddenly seemed to shift in his hands. The ink on the page began to blur, the numbers and names dissolving into meaningless smudges. "Holmes," I exclaimed, staring in disbelief. "The writing, it's disappearing." Holmes' jaw tightened as he watched the pages fade before his eyes. "They are aware of our discovery," he said, his voice calm but edged with urgency. "We must act quickly." He tore a page from the ledger, but even as he did, the ink continued to vanish, leaving behind nothing but blank parchment. Holmes folded the page and tucked it into his coat, his expression grim. "Come, Watson, we have what we need, for now." We left the archives, the weight of what we had witnessed pressing heavily upon me. The ledger's contents had been erased before our very eyes, a stark reminder of the League's reach and power. Yet Holmes seemed undeterred, his focus unwavering. As we stepped out into the foggy night, I turned to him. "What now, Holmes? The ledger is gone. How can we possibly proceed?" Holmes reached into his coat and produced the folded page. Though the ink had faded, faint traces of the original writing remained, enough, perhaps, to piece together the truth. "The ledger may be gone, Watson, but its secrets are not entirely lost. We must analyze what remains and follow the trail it leaves. And there is one more lead we have yet to pursue." I frowned. "What lead?" Holmes' eyes gleamed in the dim light. "The symbol. The red thread. It is their mark, Watson, and it is the key to unraveling their conspiracy. We must find its source." I felt a surge of determination, tempered by a growing sense of dread. "And where do we begin?" Holmes turned, his gaze fixed on the distant silhouette of the city skyline. "With the one place where threads are woven, Watson. A textile mill on the outskirts of London. And if I am not mistaken, it is owned by a man whose name appeared in that ledger. A man who may yet hold the answers we seek." As we hailed a cab, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into a trap. The League's reach was vast, their methods inscrutable, and yet, as I glanced at Holmes, I saw no trace of doubt in his expression, only the cold, calculating focus of a man who would stop at nothing to uncover the truth. The game was indeed afoot, and the stakes had never been higher. Chapter 6: The Fog of Memory. The textile mill loomed before us, its towering chimneys silhouetted against the night sky. The air was thick with the acrid scent of coal smoke and damp wool, and the rhythmic clatter of machinery echoed through the empty streets. It was a place of industry, of labor, and, if Holmes was correct, of secrets. We approached the main entrance, where a lone guard stood beneath a flickering gas lamp. Holmes stepped forward, his tone authoritative. "We are here to see the owner. It is a matter of some urgency." The guard, a burly man with a weathered face, eyed us suspiciously. "Mr. Cartwright's not here. Come back in the morning." Holmes' smile was thin and humorless. "I'm afraid that won't be possible. Tell him Sherlock Holmes wishes to speak with him." The guard hesitated, then nodded and disappeared into the building. Moments later he returned, his expression unreadable. "Follow me." We were led through a maze of corridors, the air growing heavier with each step. The mill was a labyrinth of machinery and stacked crates, its dimly lit passages filled with the hum of activity. At last, we reached a door at the end of a long hallway. The guard knocked once, then stepped aside, gesturing for us to enter. The room beyond was spacious but cluttered, its walls lined with shelves of fabric samples and ledgers. At a large oak desk sat a man in his late 50s, his sharp features framed by a neatly trimmed beard. He looked up as we entered, his eyes narrowing. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice cool and measured. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Holmes stepped forward, his gaze sweeping the room. "Mr. Cartwright, I presume. We are here to discuss a matter of some delicacy, a matter involving the Red-Headed League." Cartwright's expression did not change, but I saw the faintest flicker of unease in his eyes. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." Holmes reached into his coat and produced the folded page from the ledger. Though the ink had faded, faint traces of the original writing remained. He placed it on the desk, his movements deliberate. "This ledger entry lists a series of payments made to an entity known as RHL, payments that originated from your mill. Would you care to explain?" Cartwright glanced at the page, his jaw tightening. "I don't know what this is. It must be a forgery." Holmes' smile was cold. "A forgery? Then you won't mind if we examine your records more closely." Cartwright rose from his chair, his composure slipping. "This is highly irregular, Mr. Holmes. I must ask you to leave." Holmes did not move. "I'm afraid that's not possible. You see, Mr. Cartwright, we are not the only ones interested in your activities. The Red-Headed League is watching, and they do not take kindly to loose ends." Cartwright's face paled. "You don't understand. If they find out I've spoken to you—" "They already know," Holmes interrupted. "And if you wish to survive this, you must tell us everything." For a moment, Cartwright seemed to waver. Then, with a shuddering breath, he collapsed into his chair, his face buried in his hands. "It's too late," he whispered. "They've already begun." I stepped forward, my unease growing. "What do you mean?" Cartwright looked up, his eyes filled with despair. "The threads, they're not just fabric, you see. They're something else, something I don't fully understand. But I know this, they are the key to the League's power. And now, they're everywhere." Holmes' expression darkened. "Explain." Cartwright hesitated, then reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small spool of red thread. He held it up, his hands trembling. "This is what they use. It's alive in a way. It weaves itself into the fabric of reality, altering memories, rewriting history. And once it's in place, there's no removing it." I stared at the thread, a chill running down my spine. It seemed ordinary enough, yet there was something about it, something that made my skin crawl. Holmes took the spool, his eyes narrowing as he examined it. "Where does it come from?" Cartwright shook his head. "I don't know. They bring it to me, and I process it. But I've never seen its source." Holmes' gaze was piercing. "And the payments, what are they for?" Cartwright's voice dropped to a whisper. "To keep me silent, to ensure I never speak of what I've seen. But it's too late for that now. They know I've failed." As if on cue, the room seemed to grow colder, the air thickening with an almost palpable tension. Cartwright's eyes widened, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "They're here," he whispered. Holmes turned, his hand instinctively reaching for his revolver. But before he could act, the door burst open and a figure stepped into the room, a man clad in a dark coat, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat. "Mr. Holmes," the man said, his voice low and menacing, "you've come too far." Holmes' expression did not change, but I saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes. "And you," he said calmly, "have made a grave mistake." The man stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. The League does not tolerate interference. You will forget what you have seen, or you will be erased. I felt a surge of adrenaline, my hand tightening around my own revolver. But before I could act, the man raised his hand, and the room seemed to shift around us. The walls blurred, the air grew heavy, and a strange, humming sound filled my ears. "Watson." Holmes' voice cut through the chaos, sharp and urgent. "Close your eyes." I obeyed, but it was too late. The world seemed to dissolve around me, my thoughts scattering like leaves in the wind. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sensation passed. When I opened my eyes, the man was gone. Cartwright sat slumped in his chair, his face pale and lifeless, and Holmes stood beside me, his expression grim. What happened?" I asked, my voice trembling. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat and produced the spool of red thread. It was intact, but something about it had changed. It seemed darker, almost malevolent. "They've made their move," he said quietly. "And now, Watson, we must make ours." Chapter 7. The Trap. The cab ride back to Baker Street was a silent one. Holmes sat with his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the spool of red thread he held in his hand. The faint hum of the city outside seemed distant, almost unreal, as though the events at the mill had cast a shadow over everything. I broke the silence first, my voice low. "Holmes, what did that man mean when he said we would forget? Is it possible they could erase our memories as well?" Holmes' expression was unreadable. "Possible, Watson, but not inevitable. The League's power lies in their ability to manipulate perception, but they are not omnipotent. If we act quickly, we can stay ahead of them." I frowned, my unease growing. "And Cartwright, what happened to him?" Holmes' jaw tightened. He was a liability. They silenced him before he could reveal more. But his death is not in vain. It has given us a crucial piece of the puzzle. He held up the spool of thread, his eyes narrowing as he examined it. "This thread is the key, Watson. It is the physical manifestation of their power, the tool they use to weave their lies into the fabric of reality. And if we can trace it to its source, we may yet unravel their conspiracy." I leaned forward, my mind racing. But how? We have no leads, no way of knowing where it comes from. Holmes' lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "On the contrary, Watson, we have one lead. The man who confronted us at the mill. He is a foot soldier, nothing more, but he will lead us to his masters." I stared at him, incredulous. "You mean to use him as bait?" Holmes nodded. "Precisely. The League operates in the shadows, but they are not invincible. They rely on secrecy and fear to maintain their control. If we can draw them into the light, we can expose them." As we arrived at Baker Street, Holmes quickly set to work, drafting a series of telegrams and issuing instructions to a network of informants. I watched in silence, my mind still reeling from the events of the evening. The thought of confronting the Red-Headed League directly was both thrilling and terrifying. But I trusted Holmes implicitly. If anyone could outwit them, it was he. The next morning, we received a response to one of Holmes' telegrams. A man matching the description of our assailant had been spotted near the docks, lurking in the shadows of a disused warehouse. Holmes' eyes gleamed as he read the message. "Our trap is set, Watson," he said, folding the telegram and slipping it into his pocket. "Now, we must spring it." We made our way to the docks, the air thick with the scent of salt and decay. The warehouse in question was a crumbling structure, its windows boarded up and its doors hanging loose on rusted hinges. Holmes led the way, his movements quick and silent, while I followed close behind, my revolver at the ready. As we approached the warehouse, Holmes paused, his sharp eyes scanning the area. "Stay close, Watson," he murmured, "and be prepared for anything." We slipped inside, the dim light filtering through cracks in the walls. The interior was a maze of crates and debris, the air heavy with the scent of mildew and rot. Holmes moved with practiced ease, his every step deliberate and precise. Then we heard it, a faint rustling, like the sound of fabric brushing against wood. Holmes held up a hand, signaling for me to stop. He pointed to a shadowy corner of the warehouse, where a figure stood, partially concealed by a stack of crates. Holmes stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "You've led us on quite the chase, but the game is over." The figure turned, and I recognized him at once, the man from the mill. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "You don't understand," he said, his voice trembling. "If I help you, they'll kill me." Holmes' expression did not change. "And if you don't, they'll erase you, just like they erased Cartwright. The choice is yours." The man hesitated, his eyes darting to the door. Then, with a shuddering breath, he nodded. "There's a meeting tonight, at the old theater on Threadneedle Street. That's where you'll find them." Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Who will we find?" The man's voice dropped to a whisper. "The weavers, the ones who control the threads, but you must hurry. They know you're coming." Before Holmes could respond, the man turned and bolted, disappearing into the shadows. I made to follow, but Holmes stopped me with a gesture. "Let him go," he said. "He has served his purpose." I frowned, my unease growing. "Holmes, this feels too easy. What if it's a trap?" Holmes' smile was thin and humorless. "It is a trap, Watson, but not for us, for them." As we left the warehouse, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into a storm. The lead's reach was vast, their methods inscrutable, and yet, as I glanced at Holmes, I saw no trace of doubt in his expression, only the cold, calculating focus of a man who would stop at nothing to uncover the truth. The game was indeed afoot, and the stakes had never been higher. Chapter 8: The Revelation. The old theater on Threadneedle Street was a relic of a bygone era, its once grand facade now crumbling and overgrown with ivy. As we approached, the moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant cry of a night bird. Holmes paused at the entrance, his sharp eyes scanning the building. "Stay close, Watson," he murmured, "and be prepared for anything." We slipped inside, the heavy doors creaking on rusted hinges. The interior was dimly lit, the flickering light of a single gas lamp casting eerie shadows across the walls. The theater was a labyrinth of corridors and staircases, its once opulent decor now faded and peeling. As we made our way through the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The air seemed to hum with a strange energy, and the faint sound of whispers echoed through the halls. Holmes led the way, his movements quick and silent. At last, we reached the main auditorium, its vast space dominated by a stage shrouded in darkness. Holmes gestured for me to stay back as he stepped forward, his voice cutting through the silence. "We know you're here," he said, his tone calm but commanding. "Show yourselves." For a moment, there was no response. Then, a figure stepped onto the stage, his face obscured by the shadow of a hooded cloak. "Mr. Holmes," the man said, his voice low and menacing. "You are persistent, I'll give you that, but persistence alone will not save you." Holmes' expression did not change. "And yet, here I am. Tell me, what is it you hope to achieve? What is the purpose of the Red-Headed League?" The man chuckled, a sound that sent a chill down my spine. "The purpose, Mr. Holmes, is control. The threads we weave are not mere fabric. They are the threads of reality itself. With them, we can rewrite history, erase memories, and shape the world to our will." I felt a surge of disbelief, tempered by a growing sense of dread. "That's impossible," I said, my voice trembling. "No one has that kind of power." The man turned to me, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Is it, Dr. Watson? Then explain the ledger. Explain the house that wasn't there. Explain the man who never existed." I had no answer. The evidence was undeniable, yet the implications were too vast to comprehend. Holmes stepped forward, his gaze piercing. "And what of the cost? How many lives have you destroyed in pursuit of your goals?" The man's smile was thin and humorless. "A small price to pay for the greater good. But you wouldn't understand, Mr. Holmes. You are a man of logic, of reason. You cannot comprehend the power of belief." Holmes' expression darkened. "And yet, it is logic that will unravel your conspiracy. Your threads may be strong, but they are not unbreakable." The man's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold fury. "You are a fool, Mr. Holmes, and fools do not survive in this game." He raised his hand, and the air seemed to shift around us. The walls blurred, the ground beneath our feet grew unsteady, and a strange, humming sound filled my ears. "Watson," Holmes' voice cut through the chaos, sharp and urgent. "Close your eyes." I obeyed, but it was too late. The world seemed to dissolve around me, my thoughts scattering like leaves in the wind. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sensation passed. When I opened my eyes, the man was gone. The stage was empty, the theater silent. Holmes stood beside me, his expression grim. What happened?" I asked, my voice trembling. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat and produced the spool of red thread. It was intact, but something about it had changed. It seemed darker, almost malevolent. "They've made their move," he said quietly. "And now, Watson, we must make ours." Chapter 9. The Aftermath. The cab ride back to Baker Street was a somber one. Holmes sat in silence, his gaze fixed on the spool of red thread he held in his hand. The faint hum of the city outside seemed distant, almost unreal, as though the events at the theater had cast a shadow over everything. I broke the silence first, my voice low. "Holmes, what did that man mean when he said we would forget? Is it possible they could erase our memories as well?" Holmes' expression was unreadable. "Possible, Watson, but not inevitable. The League's power lies in their ability to manipulate perception, but they are not omnipotent. If we act quickly, we can stay ahead of them." I frowned, my unease growing. "And the man at the theater, what happened to him?" Holmes' jaw tightened. "He was a pawn, nothing more. But his disappearance confirms one thing. The League is aware of our investigation, and they will stop at nothing to protect their secrets." As we arrived at Baker Street, Holmes quickly set to work, drafting a series of telegrams and issuing instructions to a network of informants. I watched in silence, my mind still reeling from the events of the evening. The thought of confronting the red-headed League directly was both thrilling and terrifying. But I trusted Holmes implicitly. If anyone could outwit them, it was he. The next morning, we received a response to one of Holmes' telegrams. A man matching the description of our assailant had been spotted near the docks, lurking in the shadows of a disused warehouse. Holmes' eyes gleamed as he read the message. "Our trap is set, Watson," he said, folding the telegram and slipping it into his pocket. "Now, we must spring it." We made our way to the docks, the air thick with the scent of salt and decay. The warehouse in question was a crumbling structure, its windows boarded up and its doors hanging loose on rusted hinges. Holmes led the way, his movements quick and silent, while I followed close behind, my revolver at the ready. As we approached the warehouse, Holmes paused, his sharp eyes scanning the area. "Stay close, Watson," he murmured, "and be prepared for anything." We slipped inside, the dim light filtering through cracks in the walls. The interior was a maze of crates and debris, the air heavy with the scent of mildew and rot. Holmes moved with practiced ease, his every step deliberate and precise. Then we heard it, a faint rustling, like the sound of fabric brushing against wood. Holmes held up a hand, signaling for me to stop. He pointed to a shadowy corner of the warehouse, where a figure stood, partially concealed by a stack of crates. Holmes stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "You've led us on quite the chase, but the game is over." The figure turned, and I recognized him at once, the man from the theater. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "You don't understand," he said, his voice trembling. "If I help you, they'll kill me." Holmes' expression did not change. "And if you don't, they'll erase you, just like they erased Cartwright. The choice is yours." The man hesitated, his eyes darting to the door. Then, with a shuddering breath, he nodded. "There's a meeting tonight, at the old theater on Threadneedle Street. That's where you'll find them." Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Who will we find?" The man's voice dropped to a whisper. "The weavers, the ones who control the threads. But you must hurry. They know you're coming." Before Holmes could respond, the man turned and bolted, disappearing into the shadows. I made to follow, but Holmes stopped me with a gesture. "Let him go," he said. "He has served his purpose." I frowned, my unease growing. "Holmes, this feels too easy. What if it's a trap?" Holmes' smile was thin and humorless. "It is a trap, Watson, but not for us, for them." As we left the warehouse, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into a storm. The lead's reach was vast, their methods inscrutable. And yet, as I glanced at Holmes, I saw no trace of doubt in his expression, only the cold, calculating focus of a man who would stop at nothing to uncover the truth. The game was indeed afoot, and the stakes had never been higher. Chapter 10. Epilogue. The Unseen Thread. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of 221B Baker Street, casting a warm glow over the sitting room. Holmes sat in his armchair, his pipe in hand, though it had long since gone cold. His eyes were fixed on the spool of red thread that lay on the table before him, its presence a constant reminder of the case that had consumed us for weeks. I sat across from him, my notebook open on my lap. Though the case was solved, I felt a lingering unease, as though the threads of the mystery were not yet fully unraveled. "Holmes," I said at last, breaking the silence, "do you think we've truly seen the last of the Red-Headed League?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached for the spool and held it up to the light, his expression unreadable. "The League is like this thread, Watson. It may appear fragile, but its reach is vast, and its influence is woven into the very fabric of our world. We have dealt them a blow, but they are not defeated." I frowned, my unease growing. Then what was the point of it all? If they can simply rebuild, erase more memories, and continue their work, what have we accomplished? Holmes' lips curved into a faint smile. "We have exposed them, Watson. We have shown that their power is not absolute, that their threads can be cut, and in doing so, we have given others the courage to resist." I nodded, though I was not entirely convinced. The thought of the League's continued existence was a heavy burden, one that I feared would weigh on us for years to come. As if reading my thoughts, Holmes set the spool down and leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "Do not despair, Watson. The battle may be ongoing, but we have struck a significant blow, and we have learned much about their methods, their weaknesses. That knowledge is a weapon, one that we can use to fight them in the future." I felt a surge of determination, tempered by a growing sense of resolve. "Then we must remain vigilant. We cannot allow them to operate unchecked." Holmes nodded, his expression grave. "Indeed, Watson, the game is far from over. But for now, we must rest and regroup. The League will not act openly, not after the damage we have done. And when they do resurface, we will be ready." As I closed my notebook and set it aside, I noticed something on the table, a small, folded piece of paper that had not been there before. I picked it up, my brow furrowing. Holmes, did you leave this here? Holmes glanced at the paper, his expression unreadable. No, Watson, I did not. I unfolded the paper, my heart pounding as I read the words written there. The thread is never truly cut. We are watching. A chill ran down my spine. Holmes, what does this mean? Holmes took the paper from me, his eyes narrowing as he examined it. It means, Watson, that the League is not yet finished with us, but neither are we finished with them. He set the paper aside, his expression calm but resolute. Let them watch. Let them plot. We will be ready. As I sat back in my chair, I felt a strange sense of calm. The mystery was far from over, but I knew that as long as Holmes was by my side, we could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The game was indeed afoot, and the unseen thread would guide us to the truth.